Hello! In this video I'm going to do a proper review and walk around and a little drive of this, which is my 1989 Fiesta Popular. So this car was registered on the 18th of April 1989, which was only 5 days after the model was actually launched on the 13th of April 1989, so it's a really early one. So the Mark III Fiesta ran from 1989 until 1997, and it was a really common sight on British roads all through the 90s and noughties. It was loads of people's first car. People's mums had one, or grandmas had one. My grandmother had one. It was an L-Reg, 93, 94-ish. Yeah, they were just everywhere. And now they're not, because, well, this one is 32 years old. Which I think is very hard to believe and makes me feel really old. Oh well. These early Populars are quite unique in having this really old-fashioned centre cap layout, which was used on other Fords as well, older ones, Cortinas I think, and some Escorts. So yeah, it's just a cap with 4 little black wheel nut covers. The design language of the Mark III Fiesta is unmistakably Ford of the late 80s, early 90s. The tailgate kind of reminds me a little bit of the Mark III Escort, probably the Mark III Escort Estate. And the front of the car is very much an evolution of the Mark II Fiesta. One of the details I love about the design is that this body crease carries on around the tailgate all the way down there. And equally there's another one that goes all the way around the tailgate, under the rear lights and up to the number plate. I just think it's a really neat, cool little touch. I do, however, think that this particular angle of the car, if I kind of squint a little bit, it does scream a little bit of Peugeot 205, a very basic one, particularly the side indicator repeater and the really basic wheel. So let's have a good look around the interior and instrumentation of this car. We'll start off with the door cards, which are really basic. They're fully trimmed, so there's no body coloured metal on show, but the top half or top part above this crease here would be fabric on a posher car, but it's still vinyl on the basic model. You can actually see, if you look really closely, that this top piece of vinyl is not the same piece of material as the bottom piece of vinyl. So the bottom vinyl would be standard across the range, and then different fabrics would be added on the top, or in this case just a little bit more of the same vinyl. The door handle, interior door handle, is very typical for Fords of the time, which is that you push it in to lock it and pull it back out again to unlock. We've also got the rather fun luxury of interior adjustable wing mirrors on both sides, which is very luxurious for an extremely basic car of its time. It's kind of surprising that it's not one of the things that was deleted from the base model, but it must have been an economic decision that it made sense to have the same moulding for everybody. So let's go across the fascia or the dashboard. So we'll start off on the right hand side where we've got an air vent, jolly exciting, and then below the air vent we've got a little cubby hole with the fuse box at the back of it. Coming up to the centre, we've got the actual instrument cluster itself, which is really nice and clear laid out, but has very little information on it. No rev counter, not even a trip meter. So yeah, it's super basic. We've got a temperature gauge, fuel gauge, which is on all the time. You've got your speedometer, and then we've got a few warning lights. Interestingly, one of the warning lights that doesn't sort of have a permanent white showing is the choke warning light, which does light up orange when the choke is pulled out and goes out when you push the choke in. We also have that extremely sort of 90s, 80s, etc. basic car thing, which is that the direction indicators only have one bulb, whichever direction you're going in. On the right of the steering wheel we have the wiper controls. This is simply up for 1 speed, up again for double speed, and then that pushes in to squirt the windscreen. There is no intermittent. Pull this towards you for rear wiper and again for rear wash. On the left hand side is the indicators and lights. So obviously indicator right and left. Then we've got the lights, which are on this little twisty thing. So twist for side lights, twist again for main beams or main headlights, and then push back for big beam and back to the middle for dipped beam, and that's your flash. Pull it forwards, and that's the horn. On top of the steering column we've got the Ford hazard warning light switch, where it was on a lot of Fords at the time. So the left hand side of the steering column hides the choke, which is kind of the most modern looking choke I've ever seen, really. That blanking plate is for the fader and balance joystick control on posher models for the radio. Underneath the steering column, that is not an adjuster for the steering column, it is in fact how to open the bonnet. Moving towards the centre console, well, first of all, let's just talk about the top of the dashboard, which is this little ridged shelf. It's really hard plastic, but that was perfectly normal for the time. We've got two air vents there. Ventilation in this car is great. It really does blow lots through those vents and the side ones, even actually when the fan's not on. To the left of the vents we've got where a clock would be on a higher spec car, but in this case it's a fairly pointless little cubby hole. Another cubby hole where I'm currently storing my hand sanitizer. Take a little trip down and we get the glove box, which in a Popular doesn't have a lid. So we have these delightful little blanking plates hiding where the sliders would be for the glove box, and also we've got some here where the hinges would be for the lid. Heating and ventilation controls are greatly simple, so we've got cold over there, hot over there, and then we've got air distribution here. That one is I think to the face out of these vents, that's for the windscreen and that's for the floor. And obviously we have a 3-speed fan. Below that we've got the heated rear window, which works really well, and we've got the rear fog light. Then we have the fabulous Ford radio cassette player, which works really well. It has key code, presets for radio stations, and a tape player. The Popular model didn't come with speakers as standard, or a radio as standard in fact, so these are some aftermarket speakers that have been put in there. Below that we've got an ashtray, which got some parking tickets in it, and we've got a blanking plug for the cigarette lighter because there isn't one in a Popular, but it is actually hiding in reality a 12 volt socket, which somebody has fitted at some point in the life of the car. It wouldn't have a 12 volt socket originally, but I'm not going to remove it, it's quite useful. On the floor below the centre console is the floor heater distribution vent. On the floor we've got the 4-speed manual gearbox, which 1, 2, 3, 4, and then for reverse you pull it over here, push it down a little bit and then into reverse. Handbrake is obviously a manual type, it's got quite a nice action to it. Goes up and down really nicely, and there's ridges under there for your fingers, so it feels pretty nice to operate. Here in the back, well, it feels fairly fine. Got a reasonable amount of leg room, reasonable amount of headroom, reasonably comfortable. No headrests, of course, because it's the 90s. But we do get seat belts because it's the 90s and not the 80s. So yes, we've got 3-point seat belts on both sides and a lap belt here in the middle. I guess the most noteworthy thing about sitting in the back of this car is the lack of parcel shelf. So you can swing your arm into the boot, and you can also see the light clusters, back of the light clusters, and some wiring. It just makes it feel just a little bit basic. But then I suppose that was the point of the Popular in a way. From a marketing point of view, it was to be so basic that it would convince you that actually it's probably worth paying just a little bit more to get a Popular Plus or an LX or whatever that is a little bit less Spartan. You know, you might get a clock and a parcel shelf and things that make you feel like you haven't made terrible choices in your life to end up with a car that's so basic. To get into the boot of a Fiesta of this age, you've got to have the key. Put which opens to reveal actually a pretty decently sized boot. You could probably get a decent sized suitcase in there, quite a lot of shopping, so really, yeah, not so bad. Inside the boot is where you'll find the little feature that makes this a retro and not a classic, which is the grab handle to close the boot. That's a fact, by the way, in case you didn't know. Right, let's give this car a little drive. So I think I might need a little bit of choke. Pull it out a little bit. Starts very nicely. So I don't know whether you can hear, there's a very slight kind of groan coming from the front passenger side suspension. That's the lower wishbone or the lower arm. I've got a new one to replace it with. Just need to get around and do that shortly. So apart from the slightly groaning suspension, this car's got quite a really good ride, and I think it's the suspension setup that makes this car feel quite so modern, because it's a world apart from all my other cars, which have got much more old-fashioned suspension setup. This has got proper struts on the front and the rear, with springs, with proper wishbones. There's just something about the way this car has been set up by Ford to be leaps above the much older style of suspension that's in the Volvos. I mean, to be fair, the Volvo 340s have got leaf springs on the rear, for example. I don't know whether you can actually hear. Well, it's kind of, what I'm about to say doesn't make any sense, but it's a really quiet car, around town certainly. It's not loud at all, which is so unusual for a Ford with this engine. There used to be, I remember as a child, they used to sound like a sewing machine. They were absolutely grim. Cruising now at 50, you can just now start to hear the engine noise coming over the kind of general cabin noise. And whilst the engine is relatively quiet up to about this sort of speed, the cabin noise does get louder and louder a bit earlier. So this car is a 1 litre, petrol obviously. It's a 999cc engine, 1 litre. It's the HCS, which stands for High Compression Swirl or something like that. Essentially it's a redesign of the old Kent engine, which was launched in 1959 for Ford. It's not quite as old as the A-Series that's in my Metro, but it's pretty old by 1989. It's 30 years old. So we've got a lovely little gear change on this as well. It's so precise and light, so much nicer than I think any of my other classics. Sorry, Volvos and Metro. It's got a lovely spring in it, so it really kind of encourages you when you're going from second to third. It really kind of pushes you into third, which is really nice. It's very precise. You know exactly which gear you're in. There's no question about it, no doubting it. I really do want to go to fifth. I just haven't got it. It doesn't exist. It's so annoying. It's really hot in here, by the way. I'm suffering for my art. Brakes are really good. They're very positive. Obviously, it's discs at the front, drums at the back, as is perfectly standard for cars of this age. And in fact, I don't know if the previous generation Fiesta still had that arrangement. I don't know if the current newer generation does. So the steering on these country roads is not that brilliant. So it's not power steering, obviously, because basic. You don't need it. The tyres are nice and skinny, but it's not heavy without the power steering at all. But it's just a little bit woolly and a little bit vague compared to the Metro, which is super direct. It's gorgeous little steering. This is much more ponderous with the steering, which is a shame because the rest of the car is quite taut. It's much less rattly as well than the other cars. You know, the Volvos are super rattly. The Metro's dashboard all rattles. This doesn't. It's really kind of pretty rattle-free, really. Apart from the groan coming from the front suspension. But as I say, that's going to be sorted at some point. Slow. It doesn't feel old and sluggish at all. It feels kind of, it's got a bit of zing, bit of pep, which is fine. It's really sprightly, modern. I don't feel like I'm in an ancient car. I've got bags of confidence, bags of ability. Yeah, it's really surprised me, I have to say. So there we have it. That's a little drive and a little review of this fabulous little Fiesta. I hope you've enjoyed it. I enjoy the car. I've got a few more jobs and bits and pieces to do on it, but otherwise I'm just enjoying driving it around for the summer as an interesting little retro to do day trips in. That's far more fun than my modern car. There we go. I hope you liked it. I've got more videos coming. See you soon.